When we think of the guillotine, we picture the blade, the wooden frame, the restraints. We imagine the crowd, the condemned, the finality of the mechanism. We think of the revolution, of Robespierre, of Marie Antoinette ascending the scaffold. But there's one element that appears in every historical account, every engraving, every witness testimony, yet almost no one asks why it was there. The wicker basket at the base of the guillotine, always present, always positioned in exactly the same place, always lined with thick layers of straw or sawdust. In paintings and drawings from revolutionary France, you can see it clearly, positioned precisely where the blade would complete its work, filled with dried plant matter, waiting. Most people assume it was simply for collection, a receptacle, something to catch what fell, a practical necessity, nothing more. But that explanation is woefully incomplete. The truth is far more calculated, more deliberate, and more revealing about how the state engineered public executions as instruments of control and efficiency. Why straw? Why that particular material in that specific arrangement in that precise location? Why not cloth or sand or simply bare wicker? Why did executioners' supply lists always include multiple bales? Why did the revolutionary government maintain strict protocols about how it should be arranged and when it should be replaced? The answer isn't about dignity or respect. It isn't about tradition or symbolism alone. It's about solving a series of practical problems that arose when the state industrialized death and needed the machine to work perfectly, predictably, every single time, in front of thousands of witnesses who were watching for any sign of weakness or disorder. This is the story of why the guillotine basket was lined with straw, and what that seemingly insignificant detail reveals about the cold, methodical logic of revolutionary justice and the engineering of state power. The guillotine was officially adopted in France on April 25, 1792, during the early months of the Revolution. It was named after Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine. Though he didn't actually invent the device, he merely proposed it to the National Assembly as a more humane and egalitarian method of execution. The actual designer was Dr. Antoine Louis, secretary of the Academy of Surgery, working with German harpsichord maker Tobias Schmidt, who built the first working prototype. The revolution demanded a new form of justice that reflected its values. Under the monarchy, execution methods had varied dramatically by social class and crime. Nobles were granted the privilege of beheading by sword, a relatively quick death requiring a skilled executioner. Commoners were hanged, a slower and often botched procedure. Certain crimes warranted being broken on the wheel, quartered, or burned alive. Justice was neither equal nor efficient. The guillotine was meant to change this. It would deliver identical death to everyone, aristocrat or peasant, priest or politician. It would be swift, mechanical, and certain. No executioner's skill required, no possibility of a missed stroke, no prolonged suffering. Death would be democratized, standardized, made scientific. By 1793, during the Reign of Terror under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, the guillotine became the primary symbol of revolutionary authority. It was erected in public squares, first the Place de Grève, then the Place de la Révolution, now known as Place de la Concorde. Executions became state spectacles, attended by thousands of citizens. Street vendors sold refreshments and pamphlets. Families brought children to witness revolutionary justice in action. The state wasn't simply executing individuals convicted of crimes. It was demonstrating power, efficiency, and the absolute inevitability of revolutionary justice. Every component of the apparatus served this larger purpose, including elements that seemed merely decorative or incidental. The basket, as it turns out, wasn't an afterthought at all. Historical records are remarkably consistent on this point. Whether you read the memoirs of executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, examine courtroom documents, study contemporary engravings, or review the financial ledgers of revolutionary prisons, the straw appears everywhere. Sometimes it's described as pile, straw, sometimes foin, hay, occasionally seor, sawdust, or wood shavings, but always something absorbent, fibrous, and carefully arranged. The Sanson family, hereditary executioners for 6 generations, maintained meticulous records of their work. Charles-Henri Sanson, who personally executed Louis XVI, noted in his professional accounts the regular purchase of paille pour le panier, straw for the basket. These weren't small quantities. During the height of the terror, executions could number a dozen or more per day in Paris alone. The straw had to be replaced constantly, sometimes multiple times in a single afternoon. In drawings by artists who witnessed executions, you can see workers spreading fresh straw before each session. In testimonies from the Revolutionary Tribunal, there are casual references to the prepared basket as a standard element of execution protocol. In the financial records of the Conciergerie prison, where many condemned spent their final hours, there are specific line items for bales of straw delivered weekly to the execution site. This wasn't random. This wasn't improvised by individual executioners based on personal preference. The straw was part of official protocol, as essential to the procedure as sharpening the blade or testing the lunette, the wooden restraint that held the neck in place. Supply chains were established. Quality standards existed. Replacement schedules were maintained. But why? What specific purpose did this material serve that made it indispensable to the functioning of the guillotine? What problem was it solving that couldn't be solved any other way? The primary reason was physics. When the guillotine blade fell from its standard height of roughly 2.3 meters, approximately 7.5 feet, it traveled at approximately 7 meters per second by the time it completed its work. The blade itself weighed about 40 kilograms, 88 pounds, housed in a mouton, a weighted block, bringing the total falling mass to around 60 kilograms, 132 pounds. This wasn't just a cut, it was a delivery of tremendous kinetic energy. The severed head didn't simply drop delicately into the basket, it fell with considerable force, and more importantly, it rolled. The human head weighs between 4 and 5 kilograms, 9-11 pounds, and has an irregular shape that doesn't sit stable when detached. Without something to absorb that impact and arrest the motion, the head would bounce against the sides of the wicker basket. It could strike hard enough to potentially break through the weaving. It could roll out onto the platform or even into the crowd below. Historical accounts from early guillotine use, before protocols were fully standardized, mention exactly this problem. Heads escaping the basket, rolling across the scaffold, creating chaos and panic, and completely undermining the solemnity and authority of state justice. This was intolerable to revolutionary authorities, who needed executions to appear controlled and inevitable. Straw solved this problem elegantly. Its structure, thousands of hollow stems arranged in random interlocking directions, created what engineers would now call a progressive compression zone. When the head hit the straw, the individual stems collapsed, absorbing kinetic energy incrementally rather than reflecting it back as a solid surface would. The head embedded itself in the straw rather than bouncing. The irregular structure of the straw held it in place, preventing rolling. The straw's effectiveness came from its specific physical properties, not too soft, not too rigid, with just the right combination of give and grip, but impact absorption was only part of the engineering challenge. The other critical function of the straw was managing blood. A decapitation severs multiple major blood vessels simultaneously: the carotid arteries, which carry oxygenated blood to the brain under significant pressure, and the jugular veins, which return deoxygenated blood to the heart. At the moment of separation, these vessels are still under the pressure of a beating heart, for a few seconds at least. The result is immediate and substantial blood loss. Medical studies of decapitation, conducted on animals, we should note, indicate that blood can spray outward from severed arteries with enough force to travel several feet. Without immediate absorption, this would pool on the wooden platform of the scaffold, creating multiple problems for the executioners and their assistants. First, there was the safety issue. Blood on wood becomes extremely slippery, especially when mixed with the fine sawdust that often covered scaffold platforms. The executioner's assistants, typically 2 or 3 men, had to move quickly after each execution. They removed the body from the bascule, the tilting board that held the condemned in position, carried it to a waiting cart, returned to prepare the apparatus for the next person, and did all of this while maintaining the dignity and efficiency of the procedure. A slippery platform risked falls, delays, or visible clumsiness, all of which would undermine the spectacle. Second, there was the operational tempo to consider. During the terror, the guillotine sometimes operated continuously for hours. A single execution might take only a few minutes from the moment the condemned climbed the scaffold to the moment their body was removed, but dozens of executions meant the platform would be in constant use. Blood pooling and spreading across the wood would make the entire structure progressively more difficult and dangerous to work on. The straw absorbed blood immediately and completely, maintaining safe working conditions throughout the day's proceedings. But the straw served another crucial purpose beyond pure mechanics and safety. It controlled what the crowd could see. This was perhaps its most important function from the state's perspective. Revolutionary executions weren't private affairs conducted in prison courtyards. They were massive public events, sometimes drawing crowds of 10,000 or more. The state wanted these people to witness justice, but it needed to manage exactly how much they witnessed and what they took away from the experience. An uncontrolled decapitation is biologically chaotic in ways that can generate unpredictable emotional responses. Blood spreads in patterns that are difficult to anticipate. The severed head displays various involuntary phenomena. Residual muscle contractions can cause the eyes to flutter, the mouth to move, the facial muscles to twitch. These are purely mechanical, neurological responses. But they can look like consciousness, suffering, or appeals for help to observers who don't understand the physiology. The revolution needed executions to feel inevitable, orderly, and just, not grotesque, pitiful, or cruel. The guillotine was promoted as humane precisely because it was quick and mechanical, But the aftermath of any decapitation involves biological realities that could generate sympathy, horror, or morbid fascination in ways the state couldn't predict or control. The straw-lined basket created a crucial boundary between the act of justice and its messy physical consequences. The crowd saw the blade fall. They saw the moment of separation. They witnessed justice being done. But then the head disappeared immediately into the straw-filled basket, and the biological aftermath was contained, literally buried in plant matter and covered with cloth within seconds. This limited the spectacle to the moment of state power itself, not the uncontrolled biological consequences. It kept the focus on the guillotine as a symbol of revolutionary justice, not on the human body as an object of suffering or pity. There are several persistent myths about the guillotine basket and its straw lining that appear regularly in popular histories and historical fiction. It's worth addressing these directly because they reveal common misunderstandings about how the guillotine actually functioned and what authorities were concerned with. The first myth, that the straw was meant to muffle sounds, specifically the thud of the head hitting the basket. This appears in several novels and films, where characters describe the dull sound being softened by straw to make the execution less disturbing to witnesses. But this doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The guillotine itself was loud. The blade falling through its vertical grooves, the mouton striking the buffer at the top, the blade hitting the bottom stop, all created substantial noise that echoed across the square. The sound of a head landing in straw was negligible by comparison, and in a crowd of thousands would have been completely inaudible beyond the first few rows. Noise reduction simply wasn't a concern. The second myth, that the straw was meant to soak up blood for later sale to tanneries, dye works, or for supposed medicinal purposes. There were indeed periods in European history when executioners supplemented their income by selling various products from executions. Pieces of rope, blood, even body parts were believed to have magical or medicinal properties in some folk traditions. But by the 1790s, this practice had largely ceased, and revolutionary authorities were intensely concerned with preventing any commerce in execution relics, which could become symbols or rallying points for counter-revolutionaries. The blood-soaked straw was collected and burned, not sold. A third misconception, that sawdust was actually preferred over straw because it absorbed liquid better. And while sawdust was sometimes used, particularly in later periods and in indoor execution chambers, straw was actually more common and more effective for the outdoor, public executions of the Revolutionary period. Sawdust is very fine and becomes paste-like when saturated with liquid. This paste is slippery and difficult to work with. The guillotine wasn't a static device frozen in time. Its design evolved considerably over the decades it remained in use, and so did the protocols surrounding its operation. Understanding these variations helps us see that the straw wasn't simply traditional or arbitrary. It was a solution that was tested, modified, and refined based on practical experience. In the very early months of 1792, immediately after the guillotine's adoption, and before standardized procedures were fully established, some executioners experimented with sand in the basket instead of straw. Sand has excellent absorbent properties and was readily available. But it failed in practice for several reasons. First, sand is heavy, and when saturated with liquid, a basket full of sand became extremely difficult to move without spilling. Second, wet sand provides no cushioning effect. Heads would bounce off its surface. Third, sand offers no structural grip to prevent rolling. After several messy incidents, sand was abandoned. In provincial cities, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, and Nantes, where guillotines were erected during the Terror's expansion beyond Paris, local variations appeared based on available materials and local agricultural practices. In coastal areas, particularly in Brittany, there are records of seaweed being used, though it proved less effective than straw and was quickly replaced. In agricultural regions during harvest season, wheat chaff and oat hulls were common, as they were plentiful and effectively free. After the Thermidorian reaction ended the terror in July 1794 and executions became less frequent, the protocols began to relax. In the 19th century, when the guillotine was moved from public squares to the courtyard of La Roquette prison, and executions became pre-dawn affairs with minimal witnesses, sawdust gradually became more common than straw. The public spectacle element had diminished. Pure efficiency and cleanliness became the sole concerns, and sawdust was easier to sweep up and dispose of in an enclosed space. Internationally, when the guillotine was adopted in other jurisdictions, local adaptations reflected regional resources and conditions. What the straw ultimately reveals is something profound about how revolutionary France thought about justice, death, and state power. The guillotine wasn't just a more humane method of execution, it was the industrialization of capital punishment, and the straw was an essential component of that industrial system. Consider the scale. In June 1794 alone, during the period known as the Great Terror, over 1,300 people were guillotined in Paris. That's more than 40 executions per day on average, with some days seeing 50 or more. This kind of throughput was completely unprecedented in the history of capital punishment. Medieval executioners might conduct a handful of executions per year. Even during previous periods of political repression, the numbers were far lower. The guillotine made this scale possible, but only because every element of the system was optimized for a rapid, repeatable operation. The blade had to be sharpened according to a specific schedule. The lunette had to be positioned precisely. The bascule had to tilt at the correct angle, and the basket had to be ready to receive the head, absorb the impact and blood, contain the aftermath, be quickly emptied and refreshed for the next execution. The straw was part of this larger machine. It transformed the scaffold into something closer to an industrial facility. Efficient, repeatable, capable of processing human beings at a rate that would have been impossible with earlier execution methods. The same material that could symbolize care and cushioning also enabled mass execution on an unprecedented scale. This dual nature, humane in theory, industrial in practice, captures something essential about the revolution itself. The guillotine was presented as enlightened, egalitarian, and rational. But it was also a tool of state terror that could eliminate enemies of the revolution faster than any previous system. The straw didn't just cushion the fall, it absorbed the evidence and allowed the machine to continue without pause, hour after hour, day after day. So we return to our original question. Why was the guillotine basket lined with straw? By now, the answer should be clear, but it's worth stating explicitly because it reveals something important about how we should read historical details. The straw was there for multiple interconnected reasons. It absorbed the impact of the falling head, preventing it from bouncing or rolling out of the basket. It soaked up blood immediately, keeping the scaffold platform safe and functional for the executioner's assistants, who had to work quickly and efficiently. It contained the visual aftermath of decapitation, controlling what the crowd witnessed and keeping focus on the moment of justice rather than the biological consequences. And critically, it enabled rapid turnover between executions, allowing the guillotine to function at an industrial scale that would have been impossible without such careful engineering of every detail. The straw represents the cold rationality that characterized the revolution's approach to justice and state power. Nothing was left to chance, tradition, or individual discretion. Every element was considered, tested, and optimized. Even something as seemingly insignificant as plant matter in a wicker basket was chosen for specific mechanical, logistical, and psychological reasons. This reveals how the revolutionaries thought about power and control. They didn't just want to execute enemies of the state. They wanted to do it in a way that demonstrated total mastery over the process. The guillotine, with its carefully engineered straw-lined basket, was a machine that turned death into a predictable, repeatable, manageable event. It removed human variability from execution, replacing the inconsistent skill of an axeman with the absolute certainty of gravity and physics. The straw wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was functional. It was the solution to practical problems that arose when death became mechanized and industrialized. And in that functionality, we can read an entire worldview, one that believed human society could be perfected through reason and engineering, that believed justice could be made scientific and efficient. Thank you for watching.